Top 5 things you didn't know about Bitcoin. We are counting down the 5 facts that you haven't heard about the biggest blockchain. Bitcoin Season 2 is brought to you by Arch Network, the protocol building bridgeless apps on Bitcoin. More on Arch later on in the show. Let's kick it off. Okay, we're back. Welcome back to Bitcoin Season 2. This is Charlie and Colin. We are the co-writers, the screenwriters of Bitcoin Season 2. We tell you what's going to happen before it happens. Colin, what are you excited to talk about today?
Well, in this case, we're going to be talking about the things that have already happened and let you know about the things that maybe you didn't know that happened with Bitcoin's early history. There are a lot of little Easter eggs hidden throughout the annals of Bitcoin, and we're going to be unpacking some of those today. Some of them you have already heard of, no doubt. Some of them you may think you know the full story on, but I guarantee you there's more hiding behind the pages. So the ones that I'm most excited about are, at least the 2 I will be presenting on, our boy Laszlo Hanyecz, widely known infamously as Bitcoin Pizza Guy, actually did a crap ton for Bitcoin in the early days and was kind of the forefather of professional mining in a way, which we'll get into in a little bit. Also, I'm really excited about these unknown hard forks and inflation bugs that, if they had occurred today, would probably absolutely nuke TradFi and boomer confidence in Bitcoin as an asset class. So
yeah, so we're gonna talk about those. So boomers, if you're listening, cover your ears. This is for children only. It's like the opposite of a disclaimer. No
adult supervision required.
Exactly.
But this is a safe space.
Exactly.
It's a safe space for you to mourn the fact that you invested in a meme asset because your son-in-law ended up making more money than you year over year when you were just dollar cost averaging into the S&P. So
yeah. So let's get into it. We're gonna do this chronologically. And the first of the top 5 things you didn't know about Bitcoin goes back to before Bitcoin even began, when Satoshi Nakamoto and others were working on the Bitcoin code base. They were building what we call the Bitcoin client, like the first client that ran Bitcoin. And this client included not just the Bitcoin code, but it included a poker client. Yes, Satoshi originally imagined that you might want to play poker and gamble with your Bitcoins. So what it actually was like a command line, like text-based program within the Bitcoin client that you'd run on your computer. And you could play poker and wager Bitcoins within this client. This is, I think, comes as a surprise to a lot of people, not to a lot of OGs, that like this is a common thing in the Bitcoin technical community. So like, well, the original client include poker, but I don't think this is like as well known in normal circles. And so what happened was this client, when Satoshi was working on the code in 2008, they were updating it, making sure Bitcoin was ready to launch, as they did in early 2009. But the poker client was taken out of the launch of the Bitcoin client that made it to launch. I think it might be obvious why Satoshi took it out, because it doesn't really fully vibe with like the Bitcoin we know and love today. But this is an interesting little insight. Colin, what's your thoughts? What are your take on this?
This is news to me. I had no idea that this was actually a thing. Maybe it was just, in the dustbin of my mind. But I've got the original code base pulled up here, and in line 6, you can see C++ code generated with Xform Builder. This is not native to Bitcoin, what the C++ code is discussing. And then if we go down to, I believe it's line, 1592, you can see C Poker Lobby Dialog Base. This is on video for those who are listening on audio. And this is a code for the actual poker client that Charlie is referencing. My only take with this is that somehow, and it is now, kind of established in Bitcoin lore with this being included in the original client before Satoshi scrubbed it when he first released Bitcoin, that poker and Bitcoin are intrinsically linked, almost fated. I mean, this is like, in vitro Bitcoin and poker were destined to be together. And for those of you who may not know, a lot of poker players or a lot of early Bitcoin adopters were online poker players, because in the early days of Bitcoin, it was used and still is used as a means of payment and settlement for online poker. Now, this probably has to deal with, that's probably the case for a number of reasons, whether it's that, payment platforms and the like just didn't want to service poker clients. Maybe it's easier for international settlement, but degeneracy runs hand in hand, I guess, with both the Bitcoin ecosystem and with poker players. And if you ever wonder why you see so many, prominent Bitcoiners or other people at conferences being poker sharks, this is partly why, because it's been used for a long time as a settlement means on these poker sites.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting topic because there's a few conversations which emerge out of this. One, it is kind of interesting from a historical context that you saw Bitcoin being used as the means of settlement for the poker boom, the online gambling boom of the late 2000s, early 2010s, before that was like really kind of clamped down on by a lot of payment providers and ISPs. But then also you see this topic of like, how do you bootstrap a network like Bitcoin for users? I, again, often make this analogy to ordinals where the way ordinals came about, you had a similar all-in-one client that Casey Rodamore built, that inscribed, that also displayed, that lets you run a whole server. It wasn't simply just allowing you to track Satoshis. It was delivering the entire kind of user experience, both the idea and the product. And so it's interesting that you see Satoshi include a poker client because maybe the thought was to, on day one, already give like a thing to do with these new tokens. And if you, if you bring up like the path of the adoption of money, like money goes through phases where it has to kind of be used for something incrementally, getting bigger and more serious over time. And you do, with all new systems, have a user bootstrapping challenge. So poker could have been that mechanism. And then the other one is, which I bring up, which is I push back against this idea that Bitcoin is this pure, morally righteous blockchain, because Satoshi themselves included something which was inherently speculative gambling and not really like pearly white as I think many Bitcoiners try to frame Bitcoin as.
And to build on what you're saying about bootstrapping a new monetary system like Bitcoin with early use cases, the use case that really skyrocketed Bitcoin's value and put it into the fore of public conversation, as we've covered on Bitcoin Season 2 and Writer's Room in the past, is the Silk Road, right? So the two primary use cases for Bitcoin in the early days were online gambling and buying drugs. Is it any wonder that it took us this long to get an ETF? I mean,
Yeah, well, again, boomers boomers, cover your ears. This is just for the young kids. Bitcoin apparently was used for a lot of speculation. One might say that the boomers are still using it for speculation, but on a longer timeline.
Aren't we all?
And the number two thing that you didn't know about Bitcoin is about Bitcoin's difficulty adjustment. So for those of you who are not familiar with mining, Bitcoin, in order to balance the average block time, changes how hard it is to mine a block. We call this the difficulty adjustment, and it hits about every 2 weeks. In fact, it's programmed to hit, or it says that it's programmed to be every 2016 blocks. If you were to put this in human terms, it would, on average, be about every 2 weeks. However, due to what's called an off by one error in Bitcoin that Satoshi made. The difficulty adjustment, while it's said to be every 2016 blocks, in reality, it's programmed to be every 2015 blocks, which is kind of a hilarious error. And you would ask, maybe it's an error, maybe it's a documentation error or an implementation error. The funny thing is that even all the Bitcoiners and the miners still reference the difficulty being every 2016 blocks, but in reality, Bitcoin nodes calculate it being every 2015 blocks.
Yeah, and I think that's the important distinction, because it is every 2016 blocks, but the actual calculation for what difficulty should be over that period is 2015 blocks. So that one last block at the end of every difficulty cycle, whatever's going on with the timing of that block, how quickly it was mined, that's not thrown into the calculation for how difficulty should adjust. And as Charlie said, this was an error by Satoshi. It's technically a bug. Fixing it would require a hard fork. Not the biggest priority. Not going to break Bitcoin. Not even that annoying. And honestly, it's definitely within the margin of error. How much would that actually affect the difficulty recalculation? It would be a fraction of a percent.
Yeah, I don't think anybody actually cares. Nobody really cares that it's every 2015 blocks. It's negligible. I think it just goes to show that while Satoshi may have come up at a high level with the perfect system, when they actually went to write the code, they did make a human error, such as an off by one error, which
and
we're
a good
kind
reminder:
of stuck with
Satoshi
today.
is but a man or a woman, not a god, definitely not infallible. And could you imagine going back to no one cares, trying to explain this to some dude at BlackRock or at a TradFi fund? Just eyes glazing over, thinking about, the club he's going to go to that night, or the millions of dollars that he has on the table for a deal or something like that.
I don't care about the difficulty adjustment day.
Yeah. And a good reminder, Satoshi is but a man or a woman, not a god, definitely not infallible. And could you imagine going back to no one cares, trying to explain this to some dude at BlackRock or at a TradFi fund? Just eyes glazing over, thinking about, the club he's going to go to that night, or the millions of dollars that he has on the table for a deal or something like that.
I don't care about the difficulty adjustment. The US, the Saudis are buying $5 trillion of Bitcoin through BlackRock today. And I'm okay, you're allowed to not care about the difficulty adjustment being 2015 instead of 2016, but you should know. Someone over there at BlackRock should at least know about it.
100%. And a few other bugs in Bitcoin's code that we'll cover in a little bit.
Yeah, that's not the other thing. I think for number 3, it's one of my favorite ones because it's spicy. So number 3 of the top 5 things you didn't know about Bitcoin is that Bitcoin's 21 million supply is not mentioned in the white paper. Yes, you heard that correct. Bitcoin having a supply of 21 million is not mentioned in the white paper. In fact, even further than that, there is not mention of Bitcoin having any finite supply whatsoever in the white paper. This might sound kind of crazy because you ask, isn't that core to what Bitcoin is? And I would, maybe I'll be crucified for even bringing this up. But I think it's important to know that the way we came about with 21 million is that Satoshi, in the implementation of the first Bitcoin client, set an absolute value of 21 million. This has been the subject of a lot of conversation. And I believe that Bitcoin's finite supply and 21 million number have been are core to what Bitcoin is. But it goes to show that I think, the white paper is one thing, and then Bitcoin, the network, has evolved or become something which isn't necessarily perfectly aligned with the white paper.
You heard it here, folks. One of the Bitcoin maximalists' most cherished shibboleths, the 21 million supply cap, is never mentioned in the seminal document for the network that they so fervently cling to. I think that you nailed it, though, about the white paper and the actual network being two completely separate things. Obviously they are. The white paper is more of a loose mission statement in a way. And Satoshi released it on October 31st in 2008, excuse me, right? And then the network didn't go live until January 9th. Yeah. In 2009. So he was still probably hammering out the details at the time that he published that white paper. He probably had most of the code for the core functions in place, like difficulty adjustment, all that kind of stuff. But he didn't conceivably decide on the actual hard cap until later. Maybe he had it already at the time, but that's another interesting point. When people try to do all of this divining and, call upon numerology for trying to figure out why Satoshi picked 21 million. He said in a Bitcoin talk forum back in the day that he just kind of decided on the number and that there was no, calculation or consideration that drove him to that. It's almost like it came to him in a dream or something and he just decided 21 million would be it. But that's
mapped out nicely to, it maps out nicely to like the supply schedule of, difficulty adjustment every 2 weeks and having every 4 years. Like it maps pretty well onto that given, a certain number of subunits you can divide by.
100%. And that's another interesting tidbit too. The supply is actually technically not 21 million.
Yeah, that's the other thing.
It's like 20.999999999 something else, right? It's like
this is a bonus. This is item 3.5 that you didn't know about what Bitcoin is.
Yeah, so a lot of the sacred cows being slaughtered today in Writer's Room. We're getting our hands bloodied.
Yeah. But it's really interesting because I think I actually think it improves people's understanding of Bitcoin because I would say that it is absolutely core to what Bitcoin is, that it has this finite supply. To violate that brings into question whether Bitcoin is valuable, to me at least. But it's not in the white paper. And so I think this is a point that is lost, or it also reveals how many people actually have read the foundational documents of Bitcoin. Because I bet you a lot of people have listened to 1,000 hours of podcasts about hard money and kind of skimmed over the first 2 paragraphs in the white paper, but not read the full daunting 8 pages of what is mostly kind of technical and math content in the white paper.
Do your duty to the empire, pleb. Read the white paper today. Read it every day. Memorize it. Be able to recite it backwards.
It's like you got to say your Hail Marys, You got to say your 21 Hail Marys.
21 Hail Marys and 21 Hail Marys and 2016 All Fathers.
Exactly. Let me tell you about one of the most slept on opportunities in crypto. Arch is building fast, composable DeFi apps on Bitcoin. Arch apps tap into the OG blockchain with by far the most liquidity and best brand in crypto. I've known the team for over a year. The tech they're building is solid and they are racing towards mainnet. There's dexes like Saturn, meme coins on funkybit.fun, instant loans on Cha-Ching, and so much more. Plus, they're rewarding testnet users, so join me in trying out Arch while it's still early.
So we're talking about bugs. This is a good transition into our fourth What You Didn't Know About Bitcoin, which is really 4.1 and 4.2, because we're going to be talking about 3 bugs that were introduced to Bitcoin, 2 in the early days and 1, I would say, in the later days in 2018. The first of which is probably maybe the most well-known, but maybe not. And that is the 2010 inflation bug. On August 15th, 2010, I'm reading from the Bitcoin wiki about that value overflow incident. It was discovered that block 74,638 contained a transaction that created 184 billion Bitcoin for 3 different addresses. 2 addresses received 92.2 billion Bitcoin each, and whoever solved the block got an extra 0.01 Bitcoin that did not exist prior to the transaction. This was possible because the code used for checking transactions before included them in a block didn't account for the case of outputs so large that they overflowed when summed. So basically, an older version of the code didn't account for outputs that were actually exogenous to the supply, and you could kind of input additional Bitcoin that would inflate the supply over the 21 million cap that we just discussed. This was fixed very quickly. A new version of the client was published within 5 hours that contained a soft fork change to the consensus rules that rejected output value overflow transactions, as well as any transaction that paid more than 21 million Bitcoin in any output for any reason. Now, the interesting thing about this is contentious because the blockchain was actually forked. And this is called a soft fork because it ended up being resolved pretty quickly, I guess. But as the wiki says here, although many updated, unpatched nodes continued to build on the quote bad, end quote, blockchain, the quote good, end quote, blockchain overtook it at block height 74,691, at which points all node accepted the good blockchain as the authoritative source of Bitcoin transaction history. Now, I don't know. To me, it sounds like that was a hard fork, right? You ended up having the Bitcoin blockchain split into two different transaction histories. Now, for those who don't know, a hard fork occurs when there is a backwards incompatible change to where you have certain nodes on the network following one rule set and another set of nodes following a separate rule set. And because of that, the incompatibility ends up splitting the transaction history into two. Now, this obviously resolved. There were very few people using Bitcoin at this time. It would have been catastrophic if something like this happened today. But it's a good reminder that human error lurks around all of these upgrades, right? And as we'll see with some of these, or with all of the changes to Bitcoin, and as we will see with the follow-up forks that we're going to discuss here, there's a reason that Bitcoin developers move almost at a painfully glacial pace when they want to update Bitcoin, because there are so many moving parts, not just within Bitcoin itself, but some of the other things they use, like libraries for storing data, which we'll touch in a second, that could end up screwing things up. And it ends up being a huge pain in the ass to fix. And as Bitcoin grows in its user base, the ability to fix those things, number one, is subject to greater scrutiny by the community. And the coordination is also greater when you have more cooks in the kitchen, right?
You know, on the subject of like, did Bitcoin hard fork back when we had the inflation bug? I think that's the strongest argument. That scenario is the strongest argument that we did. But there is a really interesting piece on this by Jameson Lopp, lopp.net, called Has Bitcoin Ever Hard Forked?, where he goes through and argues that, yes, there's a semantic argument that that we did, but his evaluation is that we didn't. I think this is a really interesting topic because, topics such as hard and soft forks, can be simple to explain sometimes, but to get into the weeds, they can actually get really confusing and often rely a lot on semantics. Even if we have strict technical definitions of some of these events.
So there was another fork early on in Bitcoin's history in 2013 that was completely unintentional. In the latest version of Bitcoin Core at the time, 0.8, the developers decided to switch the database used to store blocks and transactions from Berkeley DB to Level DB to create a more efficient infrastructure that would basically reduce synchronization time between nodes. So nodes have to be constantly syncing with each other on the latest block, and this would lower the latency for that. This is an article in Bitcoin Magazine, if you're watching on video, by Vitalik Buterin when he was still writing for Bitcoin Magazine back in the time.
That could be its own thing. That's like 4.3. Vitalik used to write for Bitcoin Magazine.
Yeah, he actually
owned Bitcoin Magazine.
He founded it. Yeah, which is, again, one of those things that people don't know, which is really funny. So all of these little unknowns and hidden history bits in our little Easter egg hunt today.
Yeah.
But anyway, for this fork, what ended up happening was when they made the change to the database, they didn't account for the fact that the new database actually had a limit on the inputs of data that were allowed to go in it. So as a result, there were too many transactions in a block. As Buterin writes here, in the case of Bitcoin, the limit for the database was 10,000. What happened in block 225,430 was that the single block simultaneously affected the status of over 5,000 transactions requiring more than 10,000 locks on the B tree to be made at the same time. As a result, the Berkeley DB failed. And so the older Bitcoin daemon 0.7, the earlier version, could not read the block because it was outside of its scope. As a result, this ended up splitting the chain. Developers and miners got together and they decided to revert back to 0.7. Now, this is an example of a completely unintentional hard fork Whereas before they soft forked and the chain was split because of that. This one was completely unintentional, and it was resolved shortly after. There was some loss of funds, but it didn't end up being that monetarily damaging to any of the actors involved. Some miners lost out on block rewards. Obviously, they hate that, but it ended up not being too awful. But there was a bug that was potentially catastrophic and was hidden by developers in 2018. And that is our third of this three-part part 4.
This one is spicy because we only got like this is like lore that was only recently created.
100%. And so this is taken from the great Aaron Van Weerdem of Bitcoin Magazine, one of the, if not the greatest technical writer ever to cover Bitcoin as a journalist. And the article that I'm looking at on video here is the good, the bad, and the ugly details of one of Bitcoin's nastiest soft forks yet. So the bug itself was exposed in an update of Bitcoin Core. It was Bitcoin Core 0.14, which was released on March 2017. In short, I quote Aaron here, the bug would have nodes fail to reject a block containing a transaction that spends the same coins multiple times. Indeed, it would allow for an irregular form of double spending, arguably the very thing Bitcoin was designed to prevent. So basically, at the time, the developers said that this bug would have created syncing errors and potentially bricked or crashed the blockchain, but they didn't say why. And the reason was because of this inflation and double spending bug. And they ended up hurrying to release a patch, and they released a new version of Bitcoin Core without mentioning the bug. And we didn't actually find out about the bug until afterwards. So the TLDR of this one is that this was an inflation bug pretty similar to the prior inflation bug, and it would have allowed for double spending. But all three of these would have created conditions in which you could spend coins that you wouldn't be allowed to spend via some sort of either inflating the supply, like with the first one, or through a double spend, like with the latter two. So
yeah, this kind of highlights two really interesting points. One, it highlights why Bitcoin Core contributors and that project is so conservative. In fact, they are, I would say, they have a healthy paranoia around making sure they deliver version updates with no bugs. And this is one of the reasons why there is a lot of caution around fork discussion. On the other hand, it also demonstrates how the core of the Bitcoin Core developers have so much control and influence over what the chain actually looks like. This is solved in a fairly insular, quiet, secretive fashion. So you can view this two ways. You can view this as it's really good that they did this and handled it this way. But then you can also view it as this could be a risk because this was really just a small, inside group of people who are solving an issue. I'm just glad they happened to be aligned. So, this is a really interesting case study for how Bitcoin consensus evolves. And it tells you, we had our conference up next, the first one in February. We had Rusty Russell of Blockstream say, well, developers aren't in control, but they do have this giant veto card. That, can kind of be demonstrated here that they are able to deliver patches in probably the way which is the least encumbered by having to go through the consensus building process.
Well said. Shall we move on to number 5?
The last one, number 5.
Perhaps the most well-known thing that we've talked about on this, depending on the listener. But there is another side to this history that I'm about to discuss that most people don't know. And that is the story of one Laszlo Hanyecz, the infamous Bitcoin pizza man.
Oh, the Bitcoin pizza guy whose name I can never pronounce, nor can any of the talking heads except for you, Colin.
Well, I mean, I could be completely butchering it. And so, Laszlo, if you're listening to this, I apologize.
But you also wrote the article, Colin. You're citing yourself. This is true dog fooding. This is dog fooding, baby.
This is dog fooding outside of Blockspace. This was from my days at Bitcoin Magazine in 2019. And I wrote this on Bitcoin Pizza Day in 2019, which is May 22nd, saying that the man behind Bitcoin Pizza Day is more than a meme. He's a mining pioneer. So for those who may not know, and even those who do, Laszlo is famously or infamously branded as the Bitcoin Pizza Guy because back in May 22 and 2010, May 22nd and 2010, he spent roughly 10,000 Bitcoin on 2 Papa John's pizza orders. He went on Bitcoin Talk. He said, I would like to buy some pizza and pay for it in Bitcoin. Can someone order me pizza? I will send you the Bitcoin. Voila. The Bitcoin pizza purchase was cemented in history. Now, what most people don't know about Laszlo, his very material contributions to Bitcoin are overshadowed as a result of the pizza purchase. And that is, he was a core maintainer at one time, I believe in 2010. He introduced the first Mac OS client for Bitcoin Core. So if you're running Bitcoin Core at home on a Mac OS, Laszlo is the godfather, or I should say the progenitor of that. And for my purposes as a journalist who focuses a lot on Bitcoin mining, he was the first guy to roll out a client for mining Bitcoin with a GPU. So he introduced the Mac OS client in May 2nd, 2010. And then 8 days later, he updated the thread on Bitcoin Talk with an updated Mac OS X binary client that people could use, as he writes here, to use their GPU to generate Bitcoins. This was essentially, as I will argue here, the first step away from Bitcoin's days of innocence into that of experience with regards to Bitcoin mining, because you could make an argument that with GPU mining came the first step towards more organized industrial scale Bitcoin mining that we now see today in massive data centers drawing hundreds of megawatts, right? In the early days, people were mining Bitcoin on their CPUs. Maybe they would run multiple, right? That's very likely possible. But it wasn't until Laszlo introduced GPU mining that miners started taking and buying up GPUs, and putting multiple GPU units on a rack and farming Bitcoin out of their basements, their bonus rooms, their attics, wherever, right? And so you can kind of see in the GPU mining farms that emerged from people's homes, the hobbyist side of Bitcoin mining evolving into a quasi-professional, more serious version of the early forms of Bitcoin mining that were done just largely by cypherpunk enthusiasts, right? Obviously, there were multiple iterations like ASIC manufacturing and the introduction of that by Canon in 2013 that got us to where we are today. But I think there's a strong argument to be made that Laszlo basically took the first step into creating the modern behemoths that we see today in the Bitcoin mining landscape. And that's part of the reason, at least my reading of the interview that I had with him for this article back in 2019, that he did the pizza purchase at all.
Because he had all this Bitcoin on him and he had been using it, he'd been getting it from the GPUs that he was running. So he had 10,000 Bitcoin.
100%. But even more than that, I think he had a guilty conscience. So Hanyecz was in correspondence with Satoshi at the time. And in this article, as I wrote 6 years ago, after he shared the GPU mining code with the creator, Satoshi made his opinion known that he thought it was too advanced for Bitcoin stage of development. Quote from Satoshi, "A big attraction to new users is that anyone with a computer can generate some free coins," he wrote in an email to Hanyecz. "GPUs would prematurely limit the incentive to those with high-end GPU hardware. It's inevitable that GPU computer clusters will eventually hog all the generated coins, but I don't want to hasten that day." And to quote from Laszlo, "That's when I was like, man, I feel like I crapped on your project. Sorry, dude." He was concerned that some people might be discouraged because they can't mine a block with a CPU, so I stopped advertising it after that. Now, Laszlo did not explicitly say this in the interview, but it's almost like his purchasing the pizzas were a form of penance for the fact that he hastened the GPU mining that Satoshi envisioned would happen eventually. But like he said, Bitcoin was barely a year old at this point. He didn't want that to come any sooner than it should. And so Laszlo almost divested himself of this fortune that he amassed And he didn't just do it once. So the 10,000 Bitcoin pizza order is the one that's recorded and often cited. But as he revealed in this interview with me in 2019, he estimates that he spent 100,000 Bitcoin over the following year on purchases for pizza and other things via Bitcoin Talk.
Man, it just goes to show you like the crazy path dependency of Bitcoin early on.
100%.
I mean, so you see.
Go ahead.
Oh, you see Satoshi like also talking very. Satoshi themselves were very concerned with like the adoption path that Bitcoin took. For example, some of the last things Satoshi was talking about and worried about was that when WikiLeaks under Julian Assange started taking Bitcoin donations, Satoshi was afraid that was too early for Bitcoin to receive that much attention, and they were concerned with it. It's like, man, I wish we could have. I think what was the term? Like, what was the word? I think they said, I wish we could have like, waited another couple years for this.
Right.
Yeah, and so like you can see Laszlo, a lot of the early adopters either intuitively understood this or through just association went out of their way in non-selfish manners to try to like through a guiding human personal hand improve the long-term viability of Bitcoin from a distribution and a network health standpoint.
And for those of you who are sitting at home shuddering, thinking about the fact that Laszlo didn't just spend what would now be almost $1 billion worth of Bitcoin, like roughly 930 million at the time on the first Bitcoin pizza purchase, he conceivably spent as much as what would be worth almost $10 billion today, all because he didn't want to screw up Satoshi's project, allegedly, right? That's my reading of it. But what I love about that is people always focus on the monetary side of this or the gains that Laszlo forfeited by doing this. Two things. Number one, as Laszlo told me in the interview, there was no guarantee of Bitcoin's success at this time. It was a hobbyist thing. It was the domain of obscure coders, developers, and cypherpunks and forums on the internet. No one was using Bitcoin seriously, and the Silk Road was just starting to take off. There really wasn't a monetary value assigned to Bitcoin at this point, and no one could have known that it was going to where it is today. The second thing is Laszlo has a really good humor about all of this and doesn't seem to have too much regret about it. As he says in this article, or as he quoted to me when I wrote this article, he said, we would just give people Bitcoins on the forum, sometimes 100, sometimes 1,000. And he said, I wanted to do the pizza thing because to me, it was free pizza. I mean, I coded this thing and mined Bitcoin, and I felt like I was winning the internet that day. I got pizza for contributing to an open source project. Usually hobbies are a time sink and a money sink. And in this case, my hobby bought me dinner. I just love that anecdote because he's taking it totally on the chin and has no regrets at all. Also, it's very likely that he held on to some of his Bitcoin. He was active for quite a few years afterwards. And if you see some of these interviews that local media in Florida or national media have done with him on Bitcoin Pizza Day, to kind of pluck out the salacious talking points of how much money he forfeited. He's got a beautiful home, a beautiful family. Dude's doing fine. Sure, he's not a billionaire, but would he have held those coins to today? Probably not.
It is a good headline, I think. And it's fun to talk about because it's become part of the core Bitcoin mythos. But, to anyone who says things like, man, I thought I saw Bitcoin in, 2007 and I wish I could have bought some, or, more realistically, some might have actually seen in 2010. Like, I'm kicking myself for never buying some. Like, if you bought it back then, you're super lucky. And I say like, yeah, well, you could have bought it in 2012 and 13 and 14 and 15. I like to say to the person who feels that they simply just got unlucky by not buying Bitcoin a long time ago. I think that just by not having Bitcoin today would demonstrate that you would have sold that Bitcoin on the path somewhere. I just think that like not having Bitcoin today is almost both validation that you would not have held on to it, as well as something to lament for not having done a decade ago. So, because
I think that's good.
It's like everyone's an idea guy, but very few people are the execution people.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Okay. Bonus. So some of you may be familiar with the meme "Have fun staying poor," popularized by one Udi Wertheimer in the last run up of Bitcoin in 2021. What you might not know is that is not an Udi original. In fact, it is an original from the grimy underworld of the internet, the since deceased and to never be resurrected 4chan. Now, we could not actually find proof of this. You have to take it on my word.
I tried to go to 4chan. It was down, Colin.
And it's gone forever. Apparently, the code base is completely wiped, so no one even knows how to resurrect it. There was no backup. But you're going to have to trust my word on this one as someone who frequented the Biz forums, which was the finance forum back in 2017. And this meme actually originated from people who would shield Chainlink, the Oracle protocol for Ethereum. Back in the day, this was during the ICO boom, for those who might remember. There were all of these projects getting thrown out. And Chainlink's thesis, which ended up being correct, was that all of these applications built on Ethereum are going to need an Oracle that can feed data in a fashion where the incentives are aligned, where no one's going to cheat it, right? So the thinking here is, imagine you have a betting protocol. How do you know the outcome of, how does the Ethereum network know the outcome of that protocol so the smart contracts can execute in such a way that the winners get paid and the losers lose what they staked? If you don't have a neutral Oracle, people can manipulate the data and basically steal funds that are not theirs, depending on outcomes. There are multiple other applications for this, for like DeFi and stuff in terms of pricing. Anyway, these oracles feed information to smart contracts to make sure that they execute the terms of the smart contract properly. Chainlink ended up becoming the most successful oracle for Ethereum and, one of the most successful tokens from that time. And if you were on Biz back in 2017, it was the thing that would get constantly shilled in this, almost in the same kind of, religious way that Bitcoin maximalists approach Bitcoin. If you didn't own Chainlink on Biz, people would call you highly regarded and think that you were just there to lose money. So if you weren't willing to invest in Chainlink and drink the Kool-Aid, people would say, have fun staying poor. And that was a common mantra of the posters on Biz at the time, because, Chainlink was everyone's ticket to Valhalla. And funnily enough, there's a lot of bad advice on Biz at the time. It's an anonymous open forum. Projects would show their tokens there all the time. But if you actually
people just forget all of the dumb things that were on there.
And there were a lot, including people pushing other anons to buy coins for master staking. Back in the day, this was a huge thesis where I think it was there were a bunch of them like Neo and VeChain and stuff.
Oh yeah, VeChain, yeah.
the logistics blockchain before Ethereum even launched proof of stake, right? This was 5 years before that. Master staking or master nodes were a huge thing where basically you accumulate a certain number of a token and then you can get a master node and stake and earn rewards. A lot of those are in the dustbin of history, but Chainlink has persisted. And if you'd listened to that, you would have done pretty well. But I just think that's a really funny tidbit because most people think that's a Bitcoin meme. It actually comes from the Chainlink ecosystem, which is arguably more annoying and toxic than the Bitcoin maximalist ecosystem.
Well, history is written by the victors, and Bitcoin, the market has chosen Bitcoin over Chainlink, at least as an investable asset. So we can rewrite history. In fact, we are the screenwriters of Bitcoin Season 2, and we're going to retcon the mythos of Bitcoin. So, it's now officially a Bitcoin term. Chainlink never existed in this universe. Anyway, I'm totally kidding. But Colin, we just counted down the top 5 things. Yes, we did do a clickbait title. I thank you all for listening to this. If you have any questions, love or hate the show, shout us out. Leave us a review in the description if you're listening on Spotify. Make sure you hit follow and make sure you write a review. If you're watching on YouTube, tab out of whatever video game you're playing and tab in and write a nice comment. And follow us on Twitter at CB Spears, at Azalea Hodling. Catch you all on the flip side. Okay, we're back. Okay, no, actually,
Top 5.